think from preparedness activity, one thing that I find interesting and I think is important to consider when we look at long-term planning is weather-related events. I have a background before I went into medicine and meteorology, so I have a little bit of interest in weather and climate change. And looking at this slide here, which folks may have seen, looking at the trend in temperature variability. When we look at the average temperature from 1961 to 1990, we use that as the baseline, that middle line here. We can see more recently there's been elevations in the global temperature and concerns and the impact that that translates into at the local level. Why is that important? Well, when we look at tropical cyclones in the Atlantic or American model, depending on what coast you're on in the United States, you may have a hurricane, whether it's on the east coast of the United States or the west coast. Other parts of the world, that same type of storm, a tropical cyclone, would be called either a typhoon or cyclone. That's the transfer of energy in a large storm system. And we know more recently there's been more extreme number of events that have occurred in the last several years and the impact that has to the patients that we care for. This will give you an example of the number of storms and the intensity. The brighter the storm, the color, the more intense the storms. You can see in the Western Pacific are some of the strongest storms in the world and most frequent number of events when we look at from a global perspective. This is just a few years back. 2017, the United States was the most costly hurricane season in terms of dollars from damage from storm burden that year. Kind of move ahead more locally, this is estimated numbers that I've seen locally here in Vietnam. There's been an average number of close to $5 billion a year from the impact of cyclones on an annual basis to Vietnam. Obviously, we know a lot of coastline in the country. There's a lot of potential for storm damage. But separate from these cyclone events, just regular annual flooding has significant impact as well. I would say it's a little safer to cross the street here if you're an American. The bikes are not going obviously as fast. This is this year. Again, looking at the Pacific, from Mexico to Hawaii, at this one day, August 7th, there were 5 storms, 4 that were named. To get named a storm, you have to be at a certain level of intensity. But this is in one day, showing several events that are occurring simultaneously. And the last time, apparently, there were 4 storms at the same time. was about 30 years prior. So again, that's just giving you an idea of concerns about if we believe that the world is getting warmer and the ocean temperatures are getting warmer, it's a greater chance for storm development and more energy in those storms, so potentially having a stronger impact. This is later in the year, just this past September. The same day, there were 2 very significant storms that were occurring in different parts of the world. Obviously, hurricane in the U.S. That had significant impact on the coastline. The state of North Carolina had significant amount of flooding and a reasonable amount of loss of life. In the Philippines, they had a super typhoon, Maganet, again having the same impact. And this is later, the storm that hit Guam. So I think just in terms of thinking, when we talk about preparedness activities, we could talk about the current weather, the current conditions, but you have to plan ahead and think more carefully. This is a picture I took the first trip I was in Vietnam almost 10 years ago on a drive up to Ha Long Bay. I took the picture outside the cab window. I think it's great about cooperation, but I think it's really important if you're biking here, having an umbrella is not a pretty good thing to have to give somebody can hold it for you. 3 things I'd like to mention though, there's everyday weather events, looking at extreme weather that we talked about already, and then looking ahead forward in terms of climate. When we talk about the relationship between weather, climate, and health, I think the way to break it down, weather is now, the current conditions of the atmosphere, what we're addressing. So operationally, EMS would be dealing with, for example, a heat wave that's going on, and maybe you need to staff more crews, or you need to provide more relief for those crews if they're actually outdoors. It's an operational focus. It's really a focus on treatment, often the patients in front of you, as opposed to climate. From a planning perspective, it's longer term, it's a policy issue. It's trying to prevent and overcome challenges. And we look at trying to tie climate variability to the impact in our everyday life managing patients, recognizing that we believe that there's going to be more variability and increased temperature rising over the next several decades, likely going to have more number of extreme weather events, both flooding and droughts, and potential higher impact cyclones. That can translate into downstream greater impact, particularly on vulnerable populations, both the elderly or those that do not have the ability to get out of the way of a storm or to prepare in advance of a flood. And obviously, with the rising population, there's going to be more potential patients that are exposed to these events. This is an example locally, back in Atlanta, the picture I showed you earlier. This is downtown. I don't know if you can see here, but this is actually a tornado, a very high-intense type storm, local storm that has very high winds and can cause significant damage. This is the next day from our hospital. The ambulance is here, you can see on the right, trees have fallen down. This is literally, the tornado was one block, so less than 100 yards from the hospital. And this is looking from the other, this is looking towards the hospital. And this is looking to the right. This is the street the tornado came down. Get back here. It hit this building here, you can't see, but many windows got taken out. It came down the street and continued across. Obviously caused significant damage. Only one death, very lucky. But the idea, a significant amount of damage, and could have had a much greater impact on the hospital if it was one block to the south. You can see here trees that were down. This is about 300 kilometers south of the hospital, almost the same time of a hospital that got struck by a tornado, and showing the impact. Thankfully, there was no loss of life. They had very few minutes warning to be able to pull the patients out of their room into the center part of the hospital, but you can see the amount of damage. This hospital was destroyed, and it impacted the community for several years before they recovered. Another example of an extreme weather event, again in the U.S., from flooding. These are actually hospital employees putting sandbags around a hospital as the river nearby was rising because of flooding and increased rains. Significant impact both on the hospital or healthcare institution, but also on EMS. And why EMS? Because they needed to evacuate this hospital. And again, they needed to have a plan. I would point out, not sarcastically, but the sign here, 100% private rooms at this hospital, that's pretty nice, all have a water view right now. Sandbagging in the hospital, this was really a team effort. And the decision was made as a result of the water rising that they needed to evacuate. They had already taken out the lower acuity patients. The patients that were left were those in the ICU, the sickest patients, and those that we know are most vulnerable when you need to transport them. So it's a big decision to decide to evacuate a facility, and there needs to be good coordination between, obviously, EMS and the hospital system, planning in advance and preparing for this exact event. Another example, this slide is dated back in 2008, but this past year was the worst year for wildfires in California, western part of the United States, where these two major fires converged. They had to evacuate healthcare facilities there as well. They had a number of challenges, logistical challenges. Again, planning for these events in advance really helps. Approaching it, again, from the all hazards approach is a way that can prepare you, whether it's a flood or a fire or a cyclone, to be ready. This was a storm a few years back, for those of you who remember, a big hurricane that hit the southern part or southern Gulf of the United States, New Orleans. Hurricane Katrina. This is an example of what happens when you don't have great preparedness plans in place. Picture here is the Superdome. This is a sports arena, and you can see this is after the storm. This is one of our helicopter crews looking down. They took a picture, obviously, showing part of the roof that's been removed, and they needed to evacuate 2 of the hospitals that still had patients at it that were left in the facility. So this was a big undertaking from the private sector of taking patients that were trapped at the hospital. They had generators in the hospital, but those were underwater, so they lost electricity. So a very bad situation with critical patients, getting them transferred out. And the only way out as a result of the flooding that occurred after the hurricane was by aircraft. And this happened over 3 days before the United States military got involved. It was basically a civilian operation. This is the Superdome, that picture I showed you of the sports arena. These were where people in the community went for safety, and they were stuck there essentially as part of an island because it was flooding around it for several days. And I think this storm really opened our eyes to what can happen when you have a significant event that impacts the city, and the city's overwhelmed. Obviously, by definition, a disaster, but not having a plan in place and really impacting patients' lives. A lot of patients that were not able to, a lot of people that were not able to leave the city were impacted, and then there were several hundred, almost or over 1,000 deaths that were estimated. This is the last day of the staff leaving, getting flown out of the hospital. They're pretty happy, also taking their pets. A number of these patients came to our city, back in Atlanta and surrounding communities across the country. They were airlifted by the military as part of evacuating them from the city and putting them in a place where they can get care or housing and reestablish their lives. Another example, this is the Chicago Marathon every year. I put this example up because I ran in this race. It was a very hot day. They had to cancel the race mid-race because it was too hot. And as a result, that was